We're going to talk about some programming architectures today, and specifically we're going to talk about the three-tier architecture. We're going to use a web application as a good example of this. Let's start with what we already know. Right now, our web applications, in the world of web application, we've done this presentation tier. Okay, that's working with a web server, serving up static content. And when I say static versus dynamic. Static doesn't change. So you guys create web pages that don't change. You build your web page, and every time your web page gets displayed, it displays the same way. It's not pulling content from somewhere else. Okay. There could be some cached dynamic content there, or next year we'll learn how to write JavaScript. There could be some JavaScript that let people play a game or run a program that might change the content on your page. But basically, everything that's happening, the web server gives you the page, and anything else that happens on your computer. All right. So the languages here are HTML, CSS, JavaScript. That's what we see. All right. So when we move to upper level architectures, or multiple levels, we might add in an application tier. Okay, so what's an application tier? Well, that's some programming that might run. So we might have something in ASP.NET, which is Microsoft's big world of programming, right? We might write a program in C# that generates some of the content that gets sent back to this presentation tier. Okay, so now it's not just static anymore, it's dynamic. Meaning we can change what the person sees on the screen depending on maybe what they click on or something they type in a text box or whatever. So the languages there we see ASP.NET. We can write them in C# with ASP.NET. Okay, so that would be the Microsoft's versions of web applications. The free versions, the free world, the world of free software version of that would probably be something like PHP. Node.js is another JavaScript language that runs on the server. So basically, this application tier generates content, and then the results of what happened there get sent to the presentation tier for display. Okay. Now behind that, we can also have a data tier. So our application tier might need to get some content out of a database. All right. So our application tier will talk to the backend database or data store. Okay. And the database management system, which we've been working with Microsoft SQL Server, so you know about DBMS, database management systems, to get some data. So SQL Server would be an example of that. Oracle has a database server. There's also like MongoDB is a real popular one. I could have listed a bunch of them here, but those are the databases. So a three-tier architecture, each has its own layer of programming. So we might have some people that work on the front end. Okay? And you might hear people talk about back-end programmers, right? They're the ones that write the application logic and data tier logic that give us the information that gets sent back to our presentation layer. So let's look at this in terms of models. Here's a client-server model. We've been writing web pages like this all year long. You have your PC or your browser, your browser running in your PC. Technically, the browser is the client. And you click on something or type in a web address, and that sends an HTTP request to the web server. And the web server looks around and says, hey, where's this content they're looking for? It finds the content, and it responds by sending back an HTTP response that contains HTML files, CSS files, and maybe JavaScript files, which get executed by the browser on the computer. So that's the basic client-server model. Okay, now let's break this down into a three-tier model. Okay, in a full-blown web application, our PC, browser, and web server, this part is still there. So that's our presentation tier that we talked about, right? So you might make a request from the browser, and it gets sent to the web server, and the web server says, hey, I need some dynamic content for that. I need some information, some calculations. An application needs to run to generate this content. So it makes a request to an application server. The application server runs the program, whether that's in C# or PHP or whatever. It runs some kind of program to start generating that content. It may decide that it needs some data from a database. So the program on the application server formulates a request that goes out to the database server. Okay, so that's a query basically, right? Or it could be running a stored procedure or any of those other things that we've learned about in database. So we've done database programming. We've done application programming, and we've done some web programming, but we haven't put them all together yet, but we will eventually. All right. So the database server generates the results from our query, and they get sent back to the application server. The application server, might do some calculations, do whatever it needs to do to fulfill the request it had from the web server, and it sends that content back to the web server where it gets mixed back into the web page. Actually, the mixing into the web page might happen partially up here. And then the web server sends back the HTTP response, again with our HTML, CSS, and JavaScript for the display. Okay. So here's our 3 tiers basically happening. Our lower tier involves the browser and the web server. That's our static content. Second tier, application server. Third tier, database server. Okay, the same tiers we saw over here: presentation, application, data. All right, but I want to point out to you also that it's not necessarily, we picture this as 3 different servers up here working. It's not necessarily that way. All of those servers, a server is a piece of software that runs on some hardware, right? So the web server and the application server and the data server might all be running on the same box, the same physical hardware. So over here I have an example of that. We're still doing this client server model, but now all 3 of our 3-tier architecture levels are going to run on the same box, and this is a very common configuration on the internet called a LAMP server. We call it a LAMP server. So why it's very popular because Linux is a free operating system. It's very powerful. It scales well. It comes with a free web server. So instead of using internet information services like we use on our web server, it uses the Apache web server that comes basically built in with Linux. Okay. For the database, it doesn't use Microsoft's database. It uses MySQL, which is a free database that you can also get easily installed on a Linux server. And then for the application server part, most of the time we're running PHP. A lot of PHP is a dynamic programming language that we could run for our applications. That's probably the most common. Perl used to be the most common. That's largely gone away now and been replaced with PHP. But now the new one coming up is Python. And conveniently, they all start with P. So the P in LAMP server could be PHP. It could be Perl. It could be Python. And technically, there's probably some other languages we could use there. But all 3 of these servers are running on one piece of hardware. So we still have a 3-tier architecture running on one piece of hardware. So it's important to kind of get that idea down. This client server, that gets blurry when we're up here. The web server is the server for this client, but the web server is also a client when it makes a request, right? It requests something from the application server, and the application server is a client when it requests data from the database server. Okay. So client-server relationship between these 2, client-server relationship between these 2, client-server relationship between these 2. 3-level architecture for our application. Same 3-layer architecture down here, but we run it on one box. So we have learned web programming. We've learned some application programming. We've learned some database programming, right? We know about all these things separate. By next year, we should be able to write an application that uses JavaScript to make requests from our application server, which makes requests from our database server, and we'll try to do the whole. It's called the whole stack. So that'll be coming up. We'll be able to combine all those things. But it's important right now to just understand the theory about it. While we've learned everything separately, eventually we will meld it all together.